Samantha Thompson pulled her worn cardigan tighter as the taxi wound its way through the familiar streets of Westchester County. The autumn leaves crunched beneath the wheels, their vibrant oranges and reds a stark contrast to the gray November sky. At 68, Samantha had come to appreciate these small moments of beauty, especially since losing Robert 3 years ago. "Just up ahead on the right," she directed the driver, pointing toward the colonial-style house where she'd been living with her son Andrew and his wife Sophia since Robert's passing. The 2-week visit to her sister Emma in Vermont had been a blessing, full of laughter, reminiscing, and Emma's grandchildren clamoring for stories. For the first time since Robert died, Samantha had felt the weight of grief lift slightly from her shoulders. The taxi pulled to a stop in front of the house. It was a beautiful home. Andrew had done well for himself in finance, and Sophia had impeccable taste that she wasn't shy about displaying. As Samantha paid the driver, she noticed something odd. The curtains in the living room were drawn, unusual for midday. "Need help with your bag, ma'am?" the driver asked. "No, thank you," Samantha replied, retrieving her small suitcase. "I've got it." The autumn leaves crunched under her sensible shoes as she made her way up the stone pathway. Usually, her returns were met with some acknowledgement, Andrew waving from his home office window, or Sophia greeting her at the door, even if just out of social obligation. Today, the house seemed unnaturally still. Samantha inserted her key into the lock and pushed the door open. "Hello? Andrew? Sophia? I'm back," she called, her voice echoing in the foyer. No answer came, but she heard the faint murmur of voices from the living room. Setting down her suitcase, she followed the sound, an inexplicable tension building in her chest with each step. Something felt wrong. She found them in the living room. Andrew in his expensive navy suit, sitting uncomfortably on the edge of the sofa, and Sophia perched beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her designer handbag. Their heads turned in unison as she entered, and Samantha immediately noticed the tension in Andrew's face and the strange gleam in Sophia's cold blue eyes. "Mom," Andrew said, his voice strained, "we need to talk." Samantha's stomach knotted. In her 68 years, she'd learned that conversations starting with those words rarely ended well. She set her purse down and took a seat across from them, trying to ignore the way Sophia's lips curved into what could barely be called a smile. "What's going on?" Samantha asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. Andrew cleared his throat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Dad's lawyer called yesterday. There were some final details about the inheritance that needed to be settled." He paused, glancing nervously at Sophia, who nodded encouragingly. "Apparently, Dad left specific instructions about how certain properties should be distributed." Samantha's heart began to race. Robert had always been meticulous about their finances, but he'd never mentioned any special instructions to her. "What kind of instructions?" Sophia leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, Samantha, honey, I'm so sorry you have to hear this, but it seems Robert left Andrew the penthouse in Miami Beach." Her red lacquered nails tapped against her knee as she continued. "You know, the one overlooking Biscayne Bay. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, that gorgeous terrace with the infinity pool." Samantha nodded slowly. She and Robert had vacationed there many times over the years. It was worth at least $2 million, maybe more in today's market. "And what about the cabin in upstate New York?" she asked, referring to the modest property by Lake George they'd occasionally used for summer getaways. The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew shifted in his seat, unable to meet her eyes. It was Sophia who delivered the blow with surgical precision. "That old thing went to you," she said, her voice taking on a mocking tone. "You know, the little shack by Lake George that hasn't been updated since the 1970s. No central air, that tiny kitchen, the creaky floors." She paused, letting each word sink in like poison. Honestly, it fits you perfectly, you stinking old woman." The words hit Samantha like a physical blow. She felt her face flush with shame and disbelief. For a moment, the room seemed to spin around her, and she had to grip the armrest of her chair to steady herself. Andrew's head snapped up, and for a moment, Samantha thought he might defend her. Instead, he just looked away, his cowardice as clear as daylight. "Sophia," he said weakly, "that's not necessary." "What?" Sophia said, her voice rising with false innocence. "I'm just being honest. The cabin needs so much work. And let's face it, Samantha's at that age where she should be downsizing anyway. It's actually perfect for her. Simple, manageable, no stairs to worry about breaking a hip on." Samantha sat there absorbing the cruelty of Sophia's words, the casual way she dismissed her worth, her dignity, her place in her own son's life. This woman, who she'd welcomed into their family, who she'd helped plan her wedding to her son, who she'd cooked countless meals for, was speaking to her like she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. "I think," Samantha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I should go pack my things." Sophia's smile grew wider. "Actually, Samantha, we've already taken care of that for you. Your suitcases are by the front door. We thought it would be easier this way. You know, a clean break." Andrew finally found his voice. "Mom, we're not kicking you out. It's just that Sophia's pregnant, and we need the space for the nursery and her home office." "Pregnant?" The word escaped Samantha like a gasp. This was the first she'd heard of it. Sophia placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, her eyes gleaming with triumph. 12 weeks. We wanted to wait until we were sure before telling anyone. But yes, you're going to be a grandmother." She paused, tilting her head with mock concern. "Of course, we'll need you to respect our boundaries as new parents. The cabin will give you the perfect opportunity to find your own life again." Find my own life again. The phrase echoed in Samantha's mind like a cruel joke. As if the life she'd built, the family she'd nurtured, the love she'd given had been some kind of temporary arrangement that was now inconvenient to them. She stood up on shaking legs and walked to the front door, where indeed her belongings had been packed into 4 suitcases. 43 years of marriage, 35 years of motherhood, reduced to 4 pieces of luggage sitting on the marble foyer floor like abandoned pets. "The keys to the cabin are in the side pocket of the blue suitcase," Sophia called from the living room. "Drive safely, Samantha. Those mountain roads can be dangerous for someone your age." Samantha didn't trust herself to speak. She simply picked up 2 of the suitcases and walked out the door, leaving the other 2 for her second trip to the taxi that Andrew had apparently already called for her. As she loaded her life into the trunk of a stranger's car, she caught a glimpse of Sophia watching from the window, that satisfied smirk never leaving her face. Only then did Samantha notice something else. Behind Sophia stood Andrew, not meeting her eyes, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. For just a moment he raised his hand in a half-hearted gesture that might have been a wave, or perhaps the beginning of an apology. But then Sophia's hand appeared on his shoulder, and he stepped back from the window, disappearing into the shadows of what had once been Samantha's home, too. The drive to Lake George took 3 hours. 3 hours of numbness, of disbelief, of trying to process how Samantha's life had changed so dramatically in the span of 20 minutes. The taxi driver, a kind man named Carlos with salt and pepper hair and gentle eyes, tried to make conversation, but Samantha could barely manage more than one-word responses. How do you explain to a stranger that you've just been discarded by your own family like yesterday's newspaper? "First time to Lake George?" Carlos asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "No," Samantha said softly. I used to go there sometimes." "Beautiful place," he continued. "My wife and I took the grandkids there last summer. The water's so clear you can see right to the bottom in some places." "Grandkids," The word stung. Sophia was pregnant. Samantha was going to be a grandmother, but would she even be allowed to be part of her grandchild's life? The way Sophia had spoken about boundaries made it clear that her role would be limited at best. As they drove deeper into the Adirondack Mountains, Samantha stared out the window at the passing landscape. The trees were nearly bare now, their skeletal branches reaching up to the gray November sky. How fitting, she thought. Everything stripped away, exposed and vulnerable to the approaching winter. She thought about Robert. What would he have made of this situation? He had always been the mediator in the family, the one who could smooth over conflicts with a gentle word or a well-timed joke. Without him, the delicate balance of their family dynamic had clearly collapsed. Why would he do this? She whispered to herself. Robert had been so meticulous about everything, especially their finances. Why would he leave the valuable Miami property to Andrew and give her just the old cabin? It didn't make sense. Robert knew how much she disliked the cold, how her arthritis flared up in the winter. The Miami penthouse would have been the logical choice for her. "Did you say something, ma'am?" Carlos asked. Samantha shook her head. Just thinking out loud. As they neared their destination, the road narrowed and began to wind through thicker forest. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the taxi bumped along until finally they rounded a bend and the cabin came into view. Samantha's heart sank even further. Sophia hadn't been exaggerating about its condition. The small log structure looked tired and neglected, its windows dark, the wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of accumulated leaves. The dock extending into the lake was missing several boards, and the whole property had an air of abandonment that matched exactly how Samantha felt inside. Carlos helped her carry her suitcases to the front door, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure you'll be all right out here by yourself, lady? It's pretty isolated." Samantha managed a weak smile. "I'll be fine. Thank you for your kindness." But as his taillights disappeared into the gathering dusk, she wasn't sure she would be fine at all. She fumbled with the old-fashioned key, her hands shaking from cold and emotion, and finally managed to get the door open. The smell hit her first. Not musty or unpleasant as she'd expected, but familiar. Pine wood and old leather, coffee, and something else she couldn't quite identify. She flipped the light switch, half expecting nothing to happen, but warm yellow light flooded the small living room. And that's when she saw it. The room wasn't neglected at all. Someone had been maintaining it, caring for it. The furniture was simple but comfortable. The hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polish, and there was even a small stack of firewood next to the stone fireplace, neatly arranged and ready to light. On the mantel sat a framed photograph she'd never seen before. Robert, as a young man, standing in front of this very cabin with an elderly woman she didn't recognize. Samantha picked it up, her fingers tracing the edges of the frame. Robert looked to be about 16 or 17, his lanky frame not yet filled out, but his smile, that smile she'd fallen in love with, was unmistakable. The woman beside him had her arm around his shoulders, her face creased with laugh lines, her eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. Samantha turned the frame over and saw writing on the back. "With Grandma Rose, 1962, the place where everything began." Grandma Rose? Robert had never mentioned anyone named Rose. His parents had died when he was young in a car accident, and he'd always said he had no other family. Who was this woman, and why had Robert kept her a secret all these years? Samantha's exploration was interrupted by a knock at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Who could possibly know she was here? She approached the door cautiously and peered through the small window. An elderly man stood on the porch holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. He was tall and lean, with a full head of white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Thompson?" he called, his voice deep and warm. "I'm Harold Brennan from next door. I saw the lights come on." Samantha opened the door hesitantly. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Harold smiled warmly. "Not personally, but Robert told me all about you. I've been keeping an eye on the place just like he asked me to." He held out the casserole dish. "Made you some beef stew. Figured you might be hungry after your trip." "Robert asked you to keep an eye on the place?" Samantha repeated, confused. "When did you speak to Robert?" Harold's expression grew gentle. "About a week before he passed, Mrs. Thompson. He came up here one last time. Spent 3 days going through things, organizing." He paused, his eyes studying her face. "Said his Samantha would be coming here eventually, and when she did, she'd need friends nearby." Samantha stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of Harold's words. Robert had been here a week before he died? He'd never mentioned it to her. He'd told her he was going on a fishing trip with some old colleagues, and she'd thought nothing of it. What else hadn't he told her? "He said to tell you something specific," Harold continued, breaking into her thoughts. "What did he say?" Samantha asked, her voice barely audible. Harold's eyes twinkled. "He said to tell you that sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places, and that Rose's legacy was finally coming home where it belonged." He handed her the casserole dish. "He also said to check the loose floorboard under the kitchen table when you were ready for the truth." Before Samantha could ask what he meant, Harold tipped his hat and walked back into the darkness, leaving her standing in the doorway with a casserole dish and more questions than answers. Samantha closed the door and leaned against it, her mind reeling. Robert had been here a week before he died. He'd made arrangements for someone to watch over the place. He'd left her a message about checking under the kitchen table, and he'd mentioned someone named Rose, whose legacy belonged to her. The photograph on the mantel seemed to call to her from across the room. Rose, Grandma Rose. Who was she? And what was this legacy Robert had mentioned? Samantha walked slowly to the small kitchen, her heart pounding. The table was simple pine, scarred from years of use. She set down the casserole dish and got down on her hands and knees, running her fingers along the floorboards until she found one that gave slightly under pressure. With trembling hands, she pried it up. Inside the small space beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal box. She lifted it out and carried it to the kitchen table, her fingers caressing the cool metal surface. The box wasn't locked. When she opened it, she gasped. Inside were documents, photographs, and a letter addressed to her in Robert's handwriting. But it was what lay beneath the letter that made her blood run cold with shock and recognition. Land deeds, bank statements, legal documents, and at the bottom, a geological survey report dated just 6 months before Robert's death. As Samantha began to read, her hands trembling, her phone rang, jarring her from her discovery. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. "Mom!" His voice came through, strained and somewhat panicked. "Where are you? Sophia's been calling and calling. She's worried about you driving in the dark." Samantha almost laughed. Worried about her driving in the dark. After throwing her out of her home like garbage. "I'm at the cabin, Andrew," she said calmly, her eyes fixed on the contents of the box before her. "Good." Andrew sighed with what sounded like relief. "Listen, Mom, about earlier. Sophia didn't mean what she said. She's just emotional because of the pregnancy hormones. You know how women get." How women get. This from the son she'd raised to respect and value others. She stared at the geological survey report in her hands, at the estimated value of the mineral rights, and felt something shift inside her. A resolve, a strength she hadn't known she still possessed. "I'm sure she didn't mean it," Samantha said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get settled in. It's been a long day." "Of course," Andrew replied. "We'll talk more tomorrow. Maybe look at some nice senior communities with activities and medical care nearby." Samantha ended the call without responding and turned her attention back to the box. With steady hands now, she picked up Robert's letter and began to read, ready at last to discover the truth her husband had hidden from her all these years and the unexpected legacy he had left her. Samantha's hands trembled as she unfolded Robert's letter. The paper was thick and substantial, like Robert himself had been. Dependable, solid. She recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful, measured strokes of a man who believed in precision. In their 43 years together, he had written her countless notes, tucked into lunchboxes, left on pillows, slipped into books she was reading. But this letter felt different, heavier, final. "My dearest Samantha," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then my worst fears about Andrew and his wife have come to pass. I pray I'm wrong, but I've seen the signs, sweetheart. The way they look at our home like it's already theirs. The way Sophia speaks to you when she thinks I'm not listening. The way our son has slowly stopped defending you in small moments that reveal everything about his character." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Robert had seen it too. The subtle shifts in Andrew's behavior after marrying Sophia, the gradual erosion of respect. She had dismissed these changes as her imagination, as her being too sensitive or old-fashioned. But Robert had noticed. "I need to tell you about Rose. Rose Meredith was my grandmother, not by blood, but by choice. When I was 16 and my parents died in that car accident, Rose took me in. She owned this cabin and 300 acres of the most beautiful land in the Adirondacks." Samantha paused, staring at the photograph on the mantel with new understanding. She had always known that Robert had lost his parents young, but he had been vague about what happened afterward, saying only that he'd stayed with family until college. Why had he never told her about Rose? She was a geologist, Samantha, one of the first women to graduate from Columbia with a degree in earth sciences back in 1923, when such things were almost unheard of. She spent her life studying these mountains, their composition, their secrets. She taught me about strength, not just the kind that moves mountains, but the kind that endures them. Samantha glanced at the geological survey report peeking out from beneath the other papers. A suspicion began to form in her mind. Rose spent 40 years studying this land. She knew what was beneath it long before the technology existed to prove it definitively. She made me promise that this land would never be sold to developers or mining companies who would destroy its beauty for profit. But she also made me promise that if our family ever faced hardship, if my wife ever needed security and independence, this land would provide it. She had to stop reading and walk outside onto the porch. The night air was crisp and clean, and Lake George stretched out before her like a mirror reflecting the early autumn sky. 300 acres. She owned 300 acres of pristine Adirondack wilderness. The cabin wasn't just a run-down shack, as Sophia had implied. It was the gateway to something much more significant. Back inside, Samantha continued reading. "The geological survey I commissioned before my death confirms what Rose suspected all along. Beneath our land lies one of the largest untapped lithium deposits on the East Coast. With the electric vehicle revolution, lithium has become more valuable than gold. The mineral rights alone are worth between $50 and $70 million. Samantha had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. 50 to 70 million. The worthless shack that Sophia had mocked her with was worth more than Andrew's precious Miami penthouse by a factor of 25. But Samantha, I want you to know that you have choices. You can sell the mineral rights and live in luxury for the rest of your life. You can lease them and receive a steady income that will make you financially independent forever. Or you can do what I hope you'll do. Use this gift to build something meaningful, something that helps other women who find themselves discarded and devalued by families who should love them. Tears blurred her vision as she read the final paragraphs. I've watched you give everything to our family for 43 years. I've seen you sacrifice your own dreams to support mine. Put your own needs last to ensure Andrew had every opportunity. Welcome Sophia with open arms, even when I could see she didn't deserve your kindness. You've been the foundation that held us all together, and I fear that without me there to remind them of your worth, they'll forget how precious you are. Don't let them, Samantha. You are worth more than they can possibly understand, and now you have the means to prove it. The law firm of Peterson, Chen & Associates in Albany has all the documentation you'll need. Patricia Chen has been waiting for your call. Remember that I loved you completely, that Rose would have adored you, and that sometimes the people who underestimate us give us the greatest gifts of all, the motivation to show them exactly who we really are. All my love, always and forever, Robert P.S. Check the red tackle box in the hall closet. Rose left something there for the woman who would ultimately inherit her legacy. Samantha sat at the kitchen table, Robert's letter clutched in her hands for what felt like hours. Her mind was trying to process the enormity of what she had just learned. Robert had known, perhaps for years, that Andrew and Sophia would eventually push her out. He had prepared for it, crafted this elaborate safety net, all without telling her. Part of her wanted to be angry with him for keeping such significant secrets. Why hadn't he trusted her with this information while he was alive? But another part understood. Robert had always been protective, always planning 3 steps ahead. This was his final act of love, ensuring she would never be truly vulnerable to their son's betrayal. With a deep breath, Samantha stood and walked to the hall closet. The red tackle box was right where Robert said it would be, sitting on the top shelf like it had been waiting for her all these years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small velvet jewelry box. When she opened it, she gasped. A ring. Not just any ring, but an extraordinary vintage emerald surrounded by diamonds, clearly from the 1920s. Beneath it was a note in spidery handwriting. For the woman brave enough to fight for what's rightfully hers. Rose Meredith, 1994. Samantha slipped the ring onto her right hand, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 40 years for her to claim it. Looking down at the gleaming emerald, she felt something shift inside her, a strengthening, a resolve, a connection to a woman she'd never met, but who somehow understood exactly what she might one day need. Her phone rang again, jarring her from her reverie. Andrew's name appeared on the screen for the second time that evening. "Mom, how are you settling in?" His voice carried that forced cheerfulness people use when they're trying to make themselves feel better about something they know is wrong. "Very well, actually," Samantha said, admiring Rose's ring as it caught the light. "The cabin is quite comfortable." "Good, good. Listen, I've been thinking. Maybe we were a bit hasty yesterday. Sophia feels terrible about what she said." Samantha almost laughed. Sophia felt terrible. Not because she'd been cruel, but because Andrew was feeling guilty. "Does she?" Samantha asked mildly. "Of course she's a good person, Mom. She just gets overwhelmed sometimes. Anyway, we were thinking maybe you could come back for dinner this weekend. We could talk about your future. Maybe look at some nice retirement communities together." "That's very thoughtful," she said. "But I'm quite busy here." "Busy?" Andrew sounded confused. "Doing what?" "Oh, just settling in, getting to know the neighbors. Harold Brennan has been very helpful, and I'm meeting with some people in town later today." "What people?" She could hear the suspicion creeping into his voice. Andrew had always been possessive of information, needing to know and control every detail of situations that affected him. "Just some local folks," she said vaguely. "Nothing you need to worry about." She paused, letting him wonder. "How's Sophia feeling? Morning sickness must be difficult." She's fine, managing. There was a pause. Look, Mom, about this cabin, I hope you're not getting too attached to the place. It's going to need a lot of work to be livable long term. And at your age, at my age? What, Andrew? The question hung in the air between them. She could hear him struggling to find words that wouldn't sound as callous as they actually were. I just mean that practical considerations need to come first. Heating costs, maintenance, isolation. It's not really suitable for someone in your situation. My situation. The words echoed in her mind. Elderly, discarded, dependent on their charity. I appreciate your concern, she said sweetly, but I think I'll manage just fine. After she hung up, Samantha sat down again at the kitchen table and spread out the documents from the metal box. Along with the geological survey were land deeds showing that Rose Meredith had owned not just the cabin, but 300 acres surrounding it, all now registered in Samantha's name. There were bank statements for accounts she hadn't known existed and detailed information about the lithium deposits deep beneath the property. Robert had been thorough. She had to give him that. He'd left nothing to chance. Samantha picked up her phone again and dialed the number for Patricia Chen's law office that was printed on one of the documents. A pleasant-voiced receptionist answered, and upon hearing Samantha's name, immediately put her through to Patricia Chen herself. "Mrs. Thompson?" said a warm, professional female voice. "I've been expecting your call. Robert told me you might be reaching out around this time." "He seems to have planned everything," Samantha replied, a hint of wonder in her voice. "He was very concerned about your welfare," Patricia said. "Would you like to come into the office tomorrow? We have quite a bit to discuss regarding your property and its potential." "Yes," Samantha said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I believe I would." After making the appointment with Patricia Chen for the following morning, Samantha spent the evening exploring the cabin more thoroughly. What had initially seemed like a simple, rustic retreat revealed itself to be a carefully maintained and thoughtfully equipped home. The kitchen cabinets contained quality cookware, the pantry was stocked with non-perishable essentials, and the linen closet held fresh sheets and towels. In the bedroom, clearly the master suite, she found a comfortable queen bed with a handmade quilt, and on the nightstand, a collection of books she recognized as her favorites. In a smaller second bedroom, Robert had set up what looked like a home office, complete with a desk, comfortable chair, and a filing cabinet. On the desk sat a relatively new laptop computer, a surprise, since Robert had always preferred pen and paper for most tasks. A note taped to the screen read simply, "For when you're ready to take charge. Password, Rose Meredith 1923. Samantha shook her head in wonder. How long had Robert been planning this? How much had he anticipated? She booted up the computer and entered the password. The desktop appeared, pristine and unused, with just a few carefully labeled folders. Property documents, financial information, legal resources, and Rose's research. Curious, she clicked on the last folder and found a collection of scanned notebooks, photographs, and scientific papers, all meticulously organized by date. Rose had been studying this land since the 1920s, documenting its geological formations, plant life, and potential resources with an attention to detail that matched Robert's own. One document in particular caught her eye, a handwritten letter from Rose to Robert, dated just months before her death in 1994. "My dear boy, as I near the end of my time, I find myself reflecting on the curious paths our lives take. When I took in that gangly, grief-stricken 16-year-old boy all those years ago, I had no idea I was welcoming the son I never had. Your presence in my life has been my greatest joy. I leave you this land not as a burden, but as a gift, one that comes with responsibility, yes, but also with opportunity. I have spent my life studying what lies beneath the surface, both in the earth and in people. I know what this land contains, though the world is not yet ready to value it properly. Someday this property will be worth more than either of us can imagine. When that day comes, I trust you to honor my wishes, that this land serve not just as a financial resource, but as a means to empower those who have been overlooked, just as women in science like myself were overlooked for so many decades. You have spoken often of your Samantha, of her kindness and strength. I wish I could have known her. She sounds like a woman who understands value, true value, beyond what the world typically recognizes. When the time comes, I believe she will know what to do with Rose's legacy. With all my love, Grandma Rose. Samantha closed the document, her eyes misty. She had never met Rose Meredith, but she felt a kinship with this pioneering woman who had recognized something in Robert worth nurturing, just as Samantha herself had. Her contemplation was interrupted by her phone vibrating with a text message. To her surprise, it was from Sophia, who had never texted her before in the 5 years she'd been married to Andrew. Hi, Samantha. Hope you're settling in well. Andrew and I were thinking maybe we should have the cabin appraised. Just for insurance purposes, of course. Family properties can be tricky. Let me know what you think. XOXO. The message was so transparently manipulative that Samantha almost laughed out loud. Of course, Sophia had intuited that there might be more to the cabin than appeared at first glance. She had always had a nose for money and advantage. Before she could decide how to respond, another text came through, this one from Andrew. Mom, Sophia doesn't mean to pressure you. We just want to make sure everything is properly insured and documented. For your protection. For her protection. As if she needed their help to manage her own property. The condescension was so typical of how they'd been treating her for years, as if she were incapable of making decisions or understanding her own affairs. Samantha set the phone down without responding. Let them wonder, let them worry. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of power in her relationship with her son and daughter-in-law. She had information they wanted, needed even, and she was under no obligation to share it. Instead, she returned to the kitchen and opened the beef stew Harold had brought her. It was delicious, hearty and flavorful, clearly made with care. As she ate, she gazed out the window at the moonlight reflecting off Lake George. The beauty of the place struck her anew. This wasn't just valuable land. It was magnificent land. Land worth protecting, just as Rose had wanted. By the time she went to bed, Samantha had received 3 more texts from Andrew, each more insistent than the last. She silenced her phone and placed it on the nightstand, then slipped between the cool, crisp sheets of the bed that Robert had prepared for her. As she drifted off to sleep, her hand resting on Rose's emerald ring, she felt a strange peace settling over her. Tomorrow would bring decisions and revelations, but tonight she would rest, cradled in the legacy of 2 people who had valued her more than she'd ever realized. The drive to Albany the next morning gave Samantha time to think, to plan, to imagine the looks on Andrew and Sophia's faces when they discovered what they'd actually given her. But more than that, it gave her time to remember who she used to be before she became someone who accepted being treated as disposable. Before marrying Robert, she had been Samantha Reed, a young woman with a teaching degree and dreams of opening her own school someday. Those dreams had been set aside when Andrew came along, not with resentment, but with the simple reprioritization that parenthood often requires. She had poured her energy into creating a loving home, supporting Robert's career, raising Andrew to be kind and thoughtful. Somewhere along the way, though, she'd forgotten that she was more than just Robert's wife and Andrew's mother. She was Samantha, intelligent, capable, with interests and ambitions of her own. Perhaps it was time to reclaim that woman. Patricia Chen's office was in a sleek downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. Patricia herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who greeted Samantha with a combination of professionalism and genuine warmth. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, settling behind her polished desk. "Robert spoke of you often during our meetings. He was very concerned about ensuring your security and independence." "He never mentioned any meetings to me," Samantha said, still processing the extent of Robert's secret preparations. Patricia smiled. "He wanted to surprise you. Robert spent the last year of his life setting up what he called Samantha's insurance policy. He was quite specific about how things should be handled." She opened a thick file. "First, let's discuss the mineral rights. The lithium deposit beneath your property is substantial. 3 major companies have already expressed interest in leasing agreements that would pay you approximately $12 million annually for the next 20 years. $12 million annually. The number was so large it felt abstract, like play money from a board game. However," Patricia continued, "Robert also researched several other options. There's a growing market for sustainable extraction partnerships where you maintain ownership while companies use environmentally responsible methods to access the minerals. These arrangements typically pay less initially, but provide longer-term income and preserve the land's ecological integrity." "What would Robert have wanted?" Samantha asked, thinking of Rose's letter and her emphasis on responsible stewardship. "Based on our conversations, I believe he'd want you to have choices. Financial security, yes, but also the ability to create something meaningful. He mentioned several times that you'd always talked about wanting to help other women, but never had the resources to do it." Samantha nodded slowly. In her younger years, she had been involved with a local women's shelter, volunteering when she could. She had often spoken to Robert about how she wished she could do more, especially for older women who found themselves suddenly alone and vulnerable after decades of depending on others. "What if I wanted to use some of the income to establish a foundation?" she asked. "Something that helps women who've been abandoned by their families." Patricia's eyes lit up. "Robert said you might say exactly that. He had me research the legal structures for establishing a charitable foundation. Everything is already prepared. It just needs your signature." They spent the next 2 hours going over documents, legal protections, and financial projections. By the time Samantha left Patricia's office, she understood exactly how wealthy she'd become and exactly how she wanted to use that wealth. But first, she had a family to deal with. As Samantha drove back to Lake George, she noticed her phone had 6 missed calls from Andrew and 2 from Sophia. She didn't return them. Let them wait. Let them wonder. For too long, she had been at their beck and call, dropping everything to accommodate their schedules, their needs, their demands. It was time for them to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that treatment. When she pulled into the cabin's driveway, she was surprised to see another car parked nearby, Andrew's sleek black BMW. Her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and indignation. How dare he show up uninvited at her new home? But then, wasn't that exactly what Andrew and Sophia expected? That they could intrude upon her space and time whenever they pleased, with no regard for her preferences? She found him standing on the dock, staring out at the water. When he heard her footsteps on the wooden planks, he turned with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mom, we need to talk." "Do we?" she asked, joining him at the end of the dock, maintaining a careful distance. The afternoon sun glinted off the water, and a gentle breeze rustled through the few remaining leaves on the trees. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the tension emanating from her son. Andrew ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he'd had since childhood when he was nervous or uncomfortable. "Sophia's been asking questions about this place, about why Dad left it to you specifically. She thinks there might be something valuable here that we don't know about." "Of course she did." Sophia's greed had radar for hidden assets. "What kind of something?" Samantha asked innocently. Andrew shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Land values, maybe development potential. She thinks Dad might have had reasons for keeping this place that he didn't share with us." Samantha looked out at the pristine lake, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the 300 acres of wilderness that was now hers to protect or exploit as she chose. "Your father was a very thoughtful man," she said carefully. "He always had reasons for his decisions." "Mom," Andrew's voice took on the tone he'd used as a teenager when he wanted something. "If there is something valuable here, something we missed, we could work together, pool our resources, make sure everyone benefits fairly." Everyone, meaning him and Sophia, not the women Robert and Rose had hoped would be helped by this land's riches, not the legacy they had entrusted to Samantha's care. "That's very generous of you," she said, "especially considering that yesterday you and your wife made it clear that I was no longer welcome in your home or your life." Andrew had the grace to look ashamed. "That was wrong. I know that. Sophia was emotional, and I should have handled things better." "Should have handled things better," Samantha repeated. "Is that what you call watching your wife humiliate your mother and then helping her pack my tea?" "I'm sorry," Andrew said, the words coming out strained, forced. "I'm truly sorry, but we're family, Mom. Family forgives each other." Samantha turned to face him fully. This man she'd raised from a baby, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose dreams she'd supported even when they required sacrifices she could barely afford. "You're right," she said quietly. "Family does forgive each other. But first, Andrew, family has to ask for forgiveness. Real forgiveness, not the kind that comes with conditions and expectations of shared profits." Andrew's face flushed. "I am asking for forgiveness." "No," she said, her voice steady. "You're asking for information. There's a difference." Before he could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia, even though she'd never texted her before in the 5 years she'd been married to her son. "Hi, Samantha. Hope you're settling in well. Andrew and I were thinking maybe we should have the cabin appraised. Just for insurance purposes, of course. Family properties can be tricky. Let me know what you think. XOXO. She showed Andrew the message. His face went white. "I didn't know she was going to text you," he said quickly. "That was her idea." "Of course it was," Samantha said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. "Andrew, I want you to go home to your wife. Tell her that the cabin is perfectly insured and that she doesn't need to worry about family properties that don't belong to her." "Mom, tell her," Samantha continued, her voice growing stronger, "that some gifts come with wisdom attached, and wisdom teaches us that not everything valuable can be measured in dollars." Andrew stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing someone he didn't recognize. "You're different," he said finally. "No," she replied, touching Rose's ring where it sat on her finger. "I'm exactly who I've always been. You just forgot to look." As Andrew's car disappeared down the mountain road, Samantha stood alone on the dock, watching the sun set over her lake, her land, her future. Tomorrow she would begin implementing Robert's plan. She would establish the foundation, secure the mineral rights, and build something that would help women long after she was gone. But tonight, she simply stood in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of Rose's ring on her finger, and the power of Robert's love surrounding her like armor. For 43 years, she'd been Samantha the wife, Samantha the mother, Samantha the woman who put everyone else's needs first. Tomorrow, she would begin being Samantha the foundation director, Samantha the philanthropist, Samantha the woman who owned a fortune and knew exactly how to use it. That night, Samantha had one more phone call to make. She dialed Andrew's number, and when he answered, his voice was wary. "Mom, Andrew, I want you and Sophia to come for dinner tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. There are some things about your father's legacy that I think you should understand." "Really?" Relief flooded his voice. "That's wonderful. Sophia will be so relieved." "Andrew," she interrupted gently, "this isn't a reconciliation dinner. This is an education. Tell Sophia to bring her appetite for truth. She's going to need it." She hung up before he could respond and spent the next several seconds watching the lake through the cabin's windows, its surface rippling with the evening breeze. The call had been impulsive, perhaps, but necessary. She needed to face them both directly, to establish the new parameters of their relationship. No more subterfuge, no more manipulation. Just clear, honest boundaries. Samantha spent all of Thursday preparing for what would either be the most satisfying dinner of her life or the final destruction of her relationship with her son. She drove into town early, buying ingredients for her grandmother's pot roast, a meal she knew Andrew had loved since childhood. While at the local store, she met several of her neighbors, including Harold's wife Elaine, who invited her to join their weekly bridge game. The sense of community was immediate and welcoming, so different from the polite but distant relationships she'd had in Westchester. By 5 o'clock, the cabin smelled like her grandmother's cooking. The table was set with Rose's good china that she'd found in the hutch, and she'd arranged Robert's documents in neat piles on the kitchen counter. At exactly 7 o'clock, she heard car doors slam in the driveway. Through the window, she watched Andrew and Sophia approach the cabin, their body language telling the whole story. Andrew walked hesitantly, like a man approaching his own execution. Sophia strutted beside him with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to claim a prize. She'd dressed for the occasion in a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo, her makeup applied with professional precision. She looked like she was attending a real estate closing, not a family dinner. "Samantha, hi," she called out as Samantha opened the door, her voice dripping with false warmth. "This place looks so much better in the evening light. You've really made it cozy." Cozy. The way she said it made it sound like a consolation prize for people with low expectations. "Thank you," Samantha said, stepping aside to let them in. "I hope you brought your appetites." Andrew hugged her awkwardly, his cologne unable to mask the nervous sweat she could smell beneath it. "Mom, the place really does look great. Very rustic." "Your father always loved it here," she said, watching their faces carefully. "He said it reminded him of possibilities." Sophia's eyes were already scanning the room, cataloging every piece of furniture, every decoration, every potential indicator of hidden value. Samantha could practically hear her calculating square footage and estimating renovation costs. "It has potential," Sophia said, running her manicured finger along the mantelpiece. "With the right investment, this could be quite charming. Modernize the kitchen, add a master suite, maybe expand the deck." She paused at the photograph of Robert and Rose. "Who's this woman with Dad?" "That's Rose Meredith," Samantha said, beginning to serve dinner. "She was very important to your father." "I've never heard of her," Andrew said, settling into his chair. "Your father was a private man about some things," she replied, ladling pot roast onto their plates. "He believed that some stories should be saved for the right moment." Sophia practically bounced in her seat. "What kind of stories? Was she an old girlfriend or something?" The casual disrespect in her voice made Samantha's jaw clench, but she kept her expression neutral. "Rose was a remarkable woman, a geologist. She owned this land long before your father inherited it." "Inherited it?" Andrew's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I thought Dad bought this place." "No," Samantha said, taking her seat across from them. "Rose left it to him when she died in 1994, along with some very specific instructions about what should be done with it." Sophia's eyes sharpened. Samantha could see her brain working, processing this new information, searching for angles and opportunities. "What kind of instructions?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Samantha smiled and took a bite of her pot roast. "Eat first, then we'll talk." The meal proceeded with painful small talk. Sophia gushed about the nursery they were planning, the organic baby food they would make, the private preschool they'd already researched. Andrew talked about a promotion he was expecting, a new client he'd landed, the vacation they were planning to celebrate the pregnancy. Not once did either of them ask how Samantha was adjusting to living alone, whether she needed anything, or if she was happy. Their self-absorption was so complete it was almost impressive. "This has been lovely," Sophia said as Samantha cleared the dinner plates.
"But we should probably head back soon. I get tired so easily these days."
She placed her hand protectively over her stomach.
"Being pregnant is exhausting."
"Of course," Samantha said. "But before you go, I have something to show you." She retrieved the metal box from the kitchen counter and set it on the dining table. Andrew and Sophia stared at it with obvious curiosity. "Your father left this for me," she said, opening the box slowly, along with some very interesting information about our family history. Samantha pulled out the photograph of young Robert with Rose and placed it where they could both see it clearly. "Rose Meredith was born in 1901, she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "She was one of the first women to graduate from Columbia University with a degree in geology. She spent her entire career studying the Adirondack Mountains, particularly this area around Lake George." Sophia yawned delicately. "That's nice, Samantha, but she was also," Samantha continued, ignoring the interruption, "remarkably prescient about what lay beneath the surface of this land." She pulled out the geological survey and set it on the table. Andrew leaned forward to read it, his expression shifting from boredom to confusion to shock in the span of seconds. "What is this?" he whispered. "It's a geological survey your father commissioned 6 months before he died," she said calmly. "He wanted to confirm what Rose had suspected for decades." Sophia snatched the document from Andrew's hands, her eyes scanning the technical language with growing alarm. When she reached the section marked Estimated Value of Mineral Rights, her face went completely white. "This says—" She had to clear her throat and start again. "This says there's lithium under this property worth $50 to $70 million. "That's correct," Samantha said, pulling out the mineral rights documentation. "As the sole owner of this land, I control access to one of the largest lithium deposits on the East Coast." The silence that followed was deafening. Samantha could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the wind rustling through the trees outside, the sound of Andrew's labored breathing as he processed what she'd just told them. "50 million, Sophia repeated, her voice barely audible. "You're worth $50 million. "Actually," Samantha said, consulting Patricia Chen's calculations, "with the leasing agreements I've already negotiated, my annual income will be approximately $12 million for the next 20 years. So technically, I'm worth considerably more than $50 million. Andrew's head snapped up. "Leasing agreements? What leasing agreements?" "I met with your father's attorney yesterday," she explained, enjoying the panic spreading across their faces. "Everything has been arranged. The first payment will be deposited into my account next month." Sophia stood up so quickly her chair toppled backward. "You can't do this. You can't make these kinds of decisions without consulting the family." "The family?" Samantha asked mildly. "You mean the family that packed my bags and threw me out? The family that told me I was a stinking old woman who belonged in a shack? That family?" "I didn't mean that." Sophia's composure was cracking like ice in spring. "I was emotional. Pregnancy hormones. You can't hold one moment of anger against me forever." "One moment," Samantha stood up slowly, feeling Rose's ring solid and powerful on her finger. Sophia, sweetheart, let me tell you about moments. When you moved into my house, I gave you my master bedroom and took the guest room without complaint. When you redecorated my living room and threw away 40 years of memories, I smiled and said how lovely it looked. When you banned me from my own kitchen during holidays because you wanted to be the hostess, I graciously stepped aside. Each word hit Sophia like a physical blow. Andrew sat frozen, watching his wife's carefully constructed facade crumble. Those weren't moments of anger, Samantha continued. They were consistent patterns of disrespect and cruelty that you thought I was too old and too powerless to challenge. You were wrong on both counts. Andrew! Sophia whirled toward her husband. Say something, do something. She can't just steal what should belong to our children. Andrew finally found his voice. Mom, surely we can work something out. This affects all of us. The baby, our future plans. Does it? Samantha asked. Because yesterday you seemed quite satisfied with the arrangement. You got the Miami penthouse worth $2 million, and I got the worthless cabin, remember? You both made it very clear that this division was fair and appropriate. We didn't know, Sophia screamed, abandoning all pretense of civility. If we'd known about the mineral rights, obviously we would have discussed things differently. Obviously, Samantha agreed. Which brings us to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? You're not upset about fairness or family values. You're upset about money, specifically money that you assumed would eventually be yours, but now realize will never be. Samantha pulled out the final document from the box, her new will, prepared by Patricia Chen, and already signed and notarized. I thought you should know, she said conversationally, that I've established the Rose Meredith Foundation for Displaced Women. It will provide housing, legal assistance, and financial support for women who've been abandoned or abused by their families. The foundation will receive the bulk of my estate when I die. Andrew's face had gone gray. You're giving away our inheritance? Your inheritance? Samantha laughed, the sound sharp and clear in the quiet cabin. Andrew, what exactly did you do to earn an inheritance? You're a healthy, educated, successful man with a lucrative career. Your wife comes from wealth. You have every advantage in life. What could you possibly need my money for? It's not about need, Sophia shouted. It's about family. It's about blood. That money should stay in the bloodline. Interesting philosophy, Samantha said. Tell me, Sophia, when you called me a stinking old woman and kicked me out of my home, were you thinking about bloodlines then? When you mocked my inheritance and told me it fit me perfectly, were you honoring family bonds? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Here's what's going to happen, Samantha said, her voice calm but implacable. You're both going to leave my property now. You're going to drive back to Westchester in your expensive car, return to your beautiful house, and continue your privileged lives. You'll raise your child with all the advantages money can buy. She paused, looking directly into Sophia's furious eyes. But you'll do it with the knowledge that the woman you treated like garbage is worth more than you'll ever be, and that your cruelty cost you the greatest windfall of your lifetime. You can't do this to us. Sophia's voice had become shrill, desperate. We'll contest the will. We'll prove you're mentally incompetent. You'll do nothing, Samantha interrupted, because your father-in-law was brilliant, and his attorney is even more brilliant. Every document has been prepared to withstand any challenge you might mount. Every legal protection has been put in place. You have absolutely no claim to this land or its mineral rights. Andrew finally stood up, his face a mask of defeat and disbelief. Mom, please think about what you're doing. We made mistakes, but we're still family. The baby is your grandchild. For a moment, just a moment, Samantha felt her resolve waver. This was her son, after all, her only child. and the baby Sophia carried would be her grandchild. Then she remembered the casual cruelty in Sophia's voice when she'd called her names. She remembered Andrew's cowardice as he'd watched his wife humiliate his mother. She remembered the suitcases packed and waiting by the front door, like she was an unwanted house guest overstaying her welcome. "Andrew," she said softly, "you'll always be my son, and I'll always love you. But love doesn't mean accepting abuse. It doesn't mean allowing people to treat you as disposable, and it certainly doesn't mean rewarding cruelty with wealth." She walked to the front door and opened it. "Your child will be welcome in my life if you can teach them to treat others with respect and kindness. If you can't, then this conversation is exactly the kind of legacy they'll inherit from you." Sophia stalked past her without another word, her designer heels clicking angrily on the wooden porch. Andrew paused at the threshold. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I really am sorry for how we treated you." "I know you are," she replied. "But sorry doesn't undo damage, Andrew. It just acknowledges that damage was done." After their car disappeared into the darkness, Samantha stood on her porch looking out over her lake, her mountains, her 300 acres of pristine wilderness. The night was clear and cold, with more stars visible than she'd ever seen from the city. She thought about Robert, about the careful way he'd planned this moment, the love that had motivated him to protect her even after his death. She thought about Rose, the pioneering woman who'd built a legacy of independence and strength that had now passed to her. And she thought about tomorrow, when she would begin the real work of the Rose Meredith Foundation. There were women in shelters tonight who needed safe housing. There were single mothers working multiple jobs who needed financial assistance. There were elderly women being pressured by their families to give up their independence who needed legal protection. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Andrew. "Mom, please reconsider. We can start over. Be a real family again." Samantha smiled as she typed her response. "We were a real family for 40 years until you decided I wasn't worth keeping. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, but new bridges can be constructed. The choice is yours." 6 months later, Samantha stood in the main hall of the Rose Meredith Center for Women, watching as their first residents moved into their new apartments. The center, built on a small portion of her land, provided temporary housing for up to 50 women and their children, along with job training, legal services, and financial counseling. Harold Brennan, who'd become both her closest neighbor and her dearest friend, helped her cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. His wife Elaine had been instrumental in designing the communal spaces, ensuring they were both beautiful and practical. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the mysterious philanthropist who'd appeared seemingly from nowhere with unlimited resources and an unlimited commitment to helping displaced women. Samantha never mentioned her son or daughter-in-law in any of the interviews. Andrew had called twice since that dinner at the cabin. Once to tell her that Sophia had given birth to a healthy baby girl named Emma. Once to ask if she wanted to meet her granddaughter. She'd said yes to meeting Emma, but only if Andrew came alone and understood that being a grandmother was a privilege that had to be earned through consistent respect and kindness. He never called back, but that was his choice to make. She'd learned that you can't force people to love you properly, but you can refuse to accept being loved poorly. The center had already helped 37 women and 16 children in its first month of operation. Some stayed only a few days, needing just enough time to get back on their feet. Others would remain for up to a year, taking advantage of the educational programs and career counseling offered on site. Samantha had hired a team of dedicated professionals to run the day-to-day operations: social workers, legal advisors, financial counselors. But she remained actively involved as the foundation's director. 3 days a week, she came to the center to teach basic financial literacy classes. The other days, she worked from the cabin, now renovated with modern amenities, but still maintaining its rustic charm. She'd also become something of a mentor to the older women who came through the center. Many of them had stories similar to her own, decades of dedication to families who ultimately discarded them when they became inconvenient. Samantha listened to their stories, shared her own, and helped them envision futures where they were valued for who they were, not just for what they could do for others. On this particular evening, as the spring sun began to set over the Adirondacks, Samantha sat on her dock with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. Rose's ring caught the light as she raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said aloud, "to hidden treasures, and to the wisdom that comes from finally understanding your own worth." The lake reflected the stars as they appeared one by one in the darkening sky, and she felt a deep peace settle over her. At 68 years old, she discovered that life's greatest adventures sometimes begin exactly when you think they should be ending. And sometimes the people who try to throw you away give you exactly the freedom you need to find out who you were always meant to be. The sound of tires on gravel caught her attention, and she turned to see headlights winding up the driveway to her cabin. For a moment her heart quickened. Was it Andrew again, coming to make another plea for reconciliation? But as the car pulled closer, she recognized Harold's old pickup truck. He and Elaine had invited her to dinner, she remembered. They were celebrating their 45th wedding anniversary, and somehow, despite only knowing her for 6 months, they had decided she was family enough to include in their celebration. Family. The word had new meaning for Samantha now. Not just blood relations, but connections based on mutual respect, kindness, and genuine care. She had more family now than she'd ever had in Westchester. Neighbors who checked on her daily, residents and staff at the center who valued her wisdom, even the local shopkeepers who greeted her by name when she came into town. As she walked up from the dock to greet Harold and Elaine, Samantha touched the emerald ring on her finger and smiled. Rose Meredith had never met her, but somehow she had known exactly what Samantha would need. Not just financial security, but a purpose, a legacy, and the courage to fight for what was rightfully hers. In the distance, a loon called out over the lake, its haunting cry echoing across the water. Samantha took a deep breath of the clean mountain air and felt gratitude wash over her. The betrayal that had brought her here had been painful, yes. But from that pain had grown something beautiful, something far more valuable than the minerals beneath her feet or the money in her accounts. She had found herself again, the woman she'd been before she'd allowed others to define her worth. And that, Samantha knew, was the greatest inheritance of all.